Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I, as always, am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson, who's coming to us from a new location today. Galen, where are you right now?
I'm down in Jersey helping out with babies on my
Okay, so not gym tan laundry, all that stuff.
no, man.
Not exactly. Not Jersey Shore.
Did you
Cool.
ever watch that show?
I never did. I just know some of the catchphrases.
Okay.
And it's funny, that was what, like 20, 25 years ago?
Is it that long? I think I watched one episode when I was in Florence in like 2011.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, it was a going concern for a long time, well, at least a decade, but I feel like it got started around 2000, something like that. Right around the time that the Putin era started in Russia. How do you like that transition?
I'm a fan. Keep it up.
I'm getting better and better. That's right. We're going to talk about Vladimir Putin. We're going to do a brief history of Vladimir Putin on today's show because today, August 15th, the day we're recording, Putin has made his way to Alaska to meet with Donald Trump to see about a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine and maybe some other deals on the side too. Trump's very excited about potential business deals and things like that. It remains to be seen how that's going to work out, but we thought it would be a great time to delve into Putin's history, which is intertwined with the history of Russia and the history of the post-Cold War era in international relations. He's one of the main players on the stage and still is. In fact, he's been in power for 25 years. And if he is in power for another decade or two, he will be, I think, outlasting Catherine the Great. He's getting up there.
Yeah, I mean he's coming up on Stalin as well, right?
Yep,
So
Stalin's the next couple years. So good for him.
I
Way to
mean
go,
one of the
Vlad.
longest serving leaders in the world today, right? I mean, I think Khamenei in Iran since 1989 has him by about a decade,
Yep.
but I'd have to think about who else has been in power longer.
Yeah, maybe some of the African dictators. That's a good question. We'll move past it for now. Putin's been around for a long time. And what's interesting about him is that if you had known him as a kid or even as a young adult, you would not have assumed that he would be one of the most powerful and also potentially richest people in the entire world. He comes from very humble beginnings. We're going to go through a brief chronology. I'll do the early part, more or less. And Galen, you'll talk more about once he's in power, what that kind of looks like. We'll both do the 90s because the 90s in Russia, woo, wild time, buddy.
Yeah, and seemingly the key to understanding how he ultimately takes power is the
That's right. Yeah,
enormous trauma of Russia in the 1990s.
not a great place, but a place where fortunes were made and lost, certainly. So anyway, Putin's story gets started as the third of three kids in St. Petersburg, which was called Leningrad in the Soviet Union in 1952, only 7 years after the end of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. A bunch of his relatives were killed in the Great Patriotic War. His dad was very badly injured. His mom was a factory worker. He lived in an apartment with, I think, three other families with like sporadic running water and electricity. Not a very good place and time to be growing up. And he was a street thug, is our understanding. And he said this himself. The one sort of notable point from Putin's childhood is that he got into judo when he was 12 years old, I think. And he eventually became very good at it and is a legitimate black belt, which means something. But this gave him discipline. And the other salient point, he was very interested in the KGB from an early age. He actually walked into the KGB recruiter's office at age 15, famously saying that he wanted to be a KGB agent. And they were like, yeah, you're a little young. You should go back to school. So he goes to law school. And we're not clear on what it means to go to Soviet law school at all. Suffice it to say that he is actually a trained lawyer, whatever that means. And he later on in his political career, he becomes very interested in legislation and, in fact, effective at promulgating legislation. We'll get into that. But he enters the KGB as basically first a case officer. He spends 16 years in the KGB, many of them in the 1980s in the GDR, German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, very close Soviet ally at this time, in Dresden. So he is fluent in German. The Berlin Wall comes down in 89. He returns to Leningrad, soon to become St. Petersburg. And one of his old law professors becomes the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, which is Russia's second city, right? I'd like to draw a connection to Los Angeles in the United States. It's a lot colder than LA, but in terms of like New York is
People in Chicago are going to be pissed, man.
Yeah, I don't care. No, Chicago's great as a third city. I lived there for a little while. So did you.
So did I, yeah.
Yeah. So Moscow is to St. Petersburg as New York is to LA, just a hell of a lot colder and quite a bit meaner, I would say. But what I'm getting at is St. Petersburg is an important place in what is now the Russian Federation in the very early 1990s. And his former law professor becomes the mayor of St. Petersburg. So he goes to work for this guy and rises very quickly in his administration. When that dude, whose name I think was Sobchak, goes to join the federal government in Moscow and work for the president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, Putin follows him. And at this time, the Yeltsin administration, he gets there in...
I think it's 96.
96. So the Yeltsin administration has been going for 5 years. It hasn't been going that well, and it's about to get worse, right, Galen?
Substantially.
Yes.
I mean, Putin's rise at this time is nothing short of meteoric. I think that term gets thrown around quite a bit, but as you were just putting it, very humble origins. So my understanding is he's had to like beg his way into the KGB. It's not like he was highly recruited or anything like that.
He was the opposite of an elite. He was basically like a street rat. And to your point, he started begging at age 15. So it took him a while, but he got there, right?
Yeah. And just by a series of quirks finds himself in Yeltsin's administration. The Yeltsin period, for many Americans, at least at the time, was viewed as a potential moment of hope when Russia was inevitably going to transition toward a stable democratic system in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He seemed to be open to cooperation with the West and more of a reformer. That is not really what we got at all. And the 90s, as we've been alluding to already, are generally seen in Russia as maybe the worst decade in certainly recent memory, but maybe going back even further.
Including World War II.
Well, right. I don't know about that. 27 million Soviets died in World War II. But, we're talking about economic chaos, really economic paralysis.
Fair enough, yeah.
And the nadir is in 1998 when Russia defaults on its debt. And people who have read the book When Genius Failed, this is the moment when the also infamous long-term capital management really falls apart, in large part because they didn't understand the implications of a Russian default on its debt. This is also the period of what's called shock therapy, the transition from state-run communism to a capitalist-oriented economy, a market-driven economy. Those reforms, aside from being carried out arguably too quickly, were not carried out especially competently. We're talking about huge amounts of graft as oligarchs take over some of the key levers of state power, the oil and gas industry, for example. Russia becomes a kleptocracy pretty quickly. Democratic reforms do not go as planned. It doesn't help that by many accounts, Yeltsin has a serious drinking problem.
By all accounts.
Yeah, by all accounts, fair enough. So I think it's in 1998. I mean, Putin is seen at this point as someone who has a basic level of competence and who's also considered loyal. And among the people I read doing just a broad literature review today for people who are interested was Stephen Kotkin, who basically said, was it Sobchak, his former law professor?
Anatoly Sobchak, yeah.
Was supposed to be arrested. Putin helped get him arranged for him to get out of the country safely. That was seen as an act of loyalty. When he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, He learned how to effectively embezzle money, not only to enrich himself and some key political allies, but to actually get some things done, which was quite rare in Russia at the time.
Yeah, and let's
So,
be clear. Everybody who could do this was doing
yeah,
this at this point in time. There was like no law enforcement. There was no Justice Department. None of that. Everybody was just stealing pieces of the Soviet Empire. And that's where these oligarchs came from. Yeltsin's family, right,
yeah.
Galen? So
And
these
by
were
the
the,
way, that point is worth stressing as much as the economic collapse, just the complete absence of any state authority to enforce laws. I mean, really, maybe not a failed state would be too strong, but complete chaos.
complete chaos. And like Russia's massive. The Federation is massive. It's got something like close to 90 states at this point in time, I
It's
think.
11 time zones. It's
It's 11
enormous.
time zones. So there's no central authority. And these governors are just doing whatever they want and ignoring laws or making their own laws. And yeah, then we get to the financial crisis, right?
Yeah. And as
Ugly.
we talked about on the show, this is something that some Americans anyway regret, the lack of any sort of financial aid program in the aftermath of the Cold War that might have helped the more Western oriented forces gain power politically or keep power politically. But this is all to say the Yeltsin people view him as at least partly competent and loyal, and they appoint him to be the head of the FSB,
Mm,
successor agency to the KGB, where he worked during the Cold War. So, in a span of less than a decade, he has gone from being a pretty low level guy working in Dresden as part of the KGB to the head of that agency's successor agency by 1998. And the year after that, he's appointed prime minister and acting president. It's at this point when something called the Second Chechen War, and if you'll permit me a brief digression, got into some rabbit holes on Chechnya that I hadn't read about in years. You want to talk about grim stuff? A lot of comparisons made to the war in Ukraine in terms of the tactics used. Utter brutality. They basically leveled the capital of Chechnya, Grozny,
yep.
used extensive air power. This was very popular among Russians because I think it was 1994 was the first Chechen War broke out. And Russia somewhat surprisingly lost that war. Chechnya is a very small autonomous region in the Caucasus, just north of Georgia. It's landlocked. It's it's a Sunni Muslim majority province that has a history of separatist movements. And so after the Soviet Union collapsed, it demanded its independence. And there was a ceasefire struck in 1996 where the Russian government basically agreed to keep its hands off the territory and give it significant autonomy. Putin escalated that fighting almost from the moment he became acting president in August 1999. The initial sparks were one, the Chechens attacked neighboring Dagestan, which was one justification. The other one, which I'm going to ask you to talk about a little bit because it was fascinating and there's all sorts of theories as to what happened, were a series of apartment bombings in 1999, which have never been definitively solved. The Russian government claims these were acts of terrorism committed by the Chechens, but that might not necessarily be the case.
So what happened was over the series of a couple months, big apartment buildings in and around Moscow blown up by bombs placed basically in the basements, which is a great way to make a building collapse and kill dozens, if not hundreds of people. So I think 300 deaths
Yeah.
and thousands of injuries. So pretty big deal. And interestingly, the FSB is caught red-handed with a bomb in a basement that didn't go off in a Moscow suburb. And they claim, oh, this is part of a training exercise. Was it? I don't know. People like Bill Browder and some well-placed Russians who later became exiles and dissidents said, oh, no, that wasn't a training exercise. These guys were actually just planting the bombs as a false flag operation. Because the presidential election that would legitimize the transfer of power from Yeltsin to Putin was coming up in 2000. They needed a pretext to make Vladimir Putin popular. He controlled the FSB prior to this, not a long time, but at least a couple years. And he would have had the wherewithal, with the assent of Yeltsin and the people around him, to pull something like this off. So false flag operation, potentially. Blame it on the Chechens. Go fight the Second Chechen War with overwhelming brutality and zero regard for civilian casualties. It's like they literally carpet bombed the capital city and just like massed artillery fire and turned it into a crater. So that's it for the Second Chechen War. And then he's elected.
So I guess we'll never know, or I don't know, maybe we will, but it's hard to say at this point. But there are question marks as to who perpetrated those apartment bombings and whether it was indeed a false flag operation or an act of Chechen terrorism. But that victory, in comparison to Russia's defeat in the First Chechen War, is broadly popular with many. And so Putin wins a presidential election in March 2000, I believe, with 53% of the vote. Now, there are still question marks over whether there was any fraud in that particular election as well. Particularly, I think he needed 50% to clear the majority needed to avoid a runoff election. My sense is that is regarded as a freer election in comparison to subsequent victories he had.
So this is an interesting point. I want to drill down on this a little bit because there's a difference between just open fraud and like ballot stuffing and things like that, and a slightly more subtle like tilting of the playing field, right? And this is the start of, I think, in political science, it's called the hybrid regime or the managed democracy, or if you prefer, competitive authoritarianism. I've heard the same basic idea called three different things over the course of the last several decades. But
welcome
the
to
idea
political
is,
science.
Yes, it's wonderful. You get the same idea rebranded over a long period of time, over and over again. And that's how people get tenure. Anyway, I can say that because I'm not in academia. The idea is not necessarily that you stuff ballot boxes and prevent people from voting. It is that you control the media. Is that you deprive other political parties of resources. It is that you just make things a little bit tougher at the margins. It's you investigate certain people for tax fraud at the wrong times. Even if you don't convict them, it distracts them, it ruins their reputation, right? So you start to see these techniques deployed in Russia in this election because it is legitimately very close. Putin is associated with what's called the Unity Party. He's not actually a member of the party at that time. There were a lot of other parties, too, that were splitting up the vote, the anti-Putin coalition.
Yeah.
So you could look at that and be like, well, this result was going to happen no matter what. It was overdetermined. Putin was legitimately popular after crushing the Chechens and helping to restore some economic sanity. I wanted to go back and say the 1998 crisis was extremely serious. It was a full-on sovereign debt default, resulting in a 6% contraction in GDP.
Which is enormous.
It's a disaster. It's a disaster. Interest rates were at 150%.
Yeah,
we're complaining at 6 to 7%.
That's what I was about to say. If you compare and like historically here, people look back at the Volcker interest rates of the 1980s at like 15% and like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. So we're talking about 8 to 10-fold that.
Yeah, you had hyperinflation and a collapse in living standards and just really bad stuff like Weimar Republic type stuff.
Yeah.
In
and
Russia.
And things had not been particularly good in the years preceding that crisis.
Not at all. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I guess like this to me is, I think most people who study Putin tend to agree on the basic story here, which is the combination of this reaction in the Second Chechen War and his ability to stabilize the Russian economy.
With just like basic competence.
Yes.
Which was lacking. Like Yeltsin was an inspirational figure in many ways, and especially in 91 and 90 and around the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was really important. And things could have gone differently if he didn't play the role that he did. But at this point in time, he's had like quintuple bypass surgery. He's drunk all the time. He's dying. So nobody's at the controls, basically.
Yeah. It's worth pointing out that there is a lot of anti-Western and anti-U.S. sentiment in Russia by the end of the 90s as well. The perception is that the United States kicked them while they were down, which is true.
I think it's entirely true.
Yeah. And that's something that he subsequently capitalizes on, but we'll get to that in a minute. But suffice it to say that when he wins in 2000, whether that was completely legitimate or not, or whether my guess is he likely would have won based on the evidence I've seen eventually, whether that was in a runoff or not. I'm not
Yeah,
in a position to say, but to your point, he was broadly popular because of Chechnya. The economy, like the name of the game for Putin's initial success politically was stability. And this is a very common story you hear today among Russians, which is whatever you think about Putin, he provided stability in contrast to this period of just complete chaos and collapse of the 1990s. And that economic story does continue for another decade or so. I think by some measures, by 2013, in dollar terms, the size of the Russian economy has increased almost tenfold. I think GDP has doubled roughly. The economy enjoys about 7% growth.
which is excellent. And it's certainly tied to an increase in commodity prices, particularly oil and gas.
Yep. So
More
I've
than
used
that,
some
though.
statistics that were like rough. If you're talking about the hydrocarbon economy, that accounts for something like 40 to 50% of this success, but half of it has to do with like basic market reforms.
Exactly. Yeah, tax collection. That's a
Yeah.
big one. Another thing that he got the governors under control. He consolidated those 90 states or whatever it is, regions and autonomous regions, and there's just all kinds of like people at this party that is the Russian Federation. He consolidates them into 7 super regions and just basically like cleans all of that up. And
The rise of China provides a lot of demand for Russian exports, it turns
yep,
out, and revives some key industries that had waned from the Soviet era. So, um, is some of this stuff probably going to happen regardless? Sure. And does he take power at arguably a propitious moment? Yeah, but the guy does have some basic competence. And I think this is a point a number of authors I read for today make that's worth repeating. He's been in power for over a quarter of a century. So to say that this is a pure accident of history and he has no kind of political abilities or political infighting capabilities, that doesn't strike me as correct.
he was actually capable of getting things done in a chaotic environment. That's probably a product of not just his training at the KGB and his legal training. I like to think of it as a product of his judo mindset. He understands.
I'm going to defer to you on all history, understanding history via judo matters.
Yeah, he understands weak points, people's weak points, country's weak points. He understands timing. He understands leverage, right? And I think one really good example of this is the people that let him into power in the late 90s were these oligarchs who were around the Yeltsin administration. They were called the family. They were Boris Berezovsky. There was another guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky and some other oligarchs as well.
Vladimir Gustinsky.
Gusinski, yep. So Gusinski and Berezovsky were media tycoons, whereas Khodorkovsky controlled the Yukos, which was I think that used to be the Soviet state oil and gas producer, or the oil producer. Right? Gas producer would be Gazprom.
So I think it had been actually privatized. It was a new company. So I don't think it was a Soviet company, but yeah, like had its roots in that. Yeah.
It has roots in stealing all the Soviet assets.
Yeah, correct. That's the key point.
So they liked Putin and designated him Yeltsin's successor. They approved that in 1998 after Yeltsin had been through 5 other guys. He had 5 other prime ministers during this tryout period. And it was like, no, like you're not loyal enough. You're not competent. You're too pro-Western, like whatever, right? Putin was the guy. And then he gets into power. And one of the first things he does is screw these guys, like really screw them. He forces 2 of them into exile, Gusinski and Berezovsky, basically takes their stuff. And then the third guy, Khodorkovsky, he jails for 10 years and just steals his company.
Holds him off his private jet.
Yeah. Like that is cold and it is opportunistic and the timing is perfect. He's disguised his intentions. He's used leverage once he's in a position of strength and he's gone for the kill. Right. And you see this over and over again in his career. And that comes like, that's what you do in judo. You wait. You wait for somebody to reveal their weakness, and then you exploit the weakness. That's what you do at the KGB as well. You blackmail people, you assassinate people, right? You run assets, you steal stuff, you do whatever it takes. And Putin's very good at everything I just described, legitimately. And it's served him very well during his career.
Yeah, and I think those parts of the story do a good job of accounting for his growing political power. Like when he first takes office after, at least after winning his first election in 2000, you could argue he doesn't really hold many of the levers of power.
Correct.
You look at what happened to Yeltsin, he's a shell of where he was in the early 90s by the time he leaves office. And as you said, these guys control the media, they control the oil and gas companies. The governors have a lot of power. Just check the guy's name. I think it was Voloshin. I'll look for it. Yeah, Alexander Voloshin was the chief of staff under Yeltsin. Is a pretty powerful guy. He takes all that power from them in a period of about 3 years or so.
Not easy to do. These are not dumb guys. These are billionaires, right? And one after the other, he just gets rid of them or subordinates them. There are some other oligarchs who play ball with him because they see that this guy actually knows what he's doing. And they need to get
one. You know, keep in mind, this is the same guy who was a former KGB officer and then head of the successor agency, the FSB. So he has people with power in the security services and intelligence services. So that's a key institution that he can leverage as well. But just to emphasize the point one more time, the man is popular at the time among ordinary Russians.
For sure.
Because of the restoration of Russian respect with what happens in Chechnya, because of the economy, because he's able to play on some anti-Western sentiment that has bubbled up as a result of the 90s. And then he's off and running. Now, I think it's worth emphasizing, I think we both think he has evolved quite a bit. I suppose one could tell a story about the premeditated actions of Vladimir Putin going back to the late 1990s. But I think to tell that story, that would be a very difficult straight arrow to point. So I think we both believe there's been some serious evolution since then. And I think it might make sense for us to move in phases on that if you're down for that.
I'm down for that. I mean, like, I think one of the main framing devices we can and should use is his evolution on his attitudes towards the West.
Yeah.
In particular. And this is probably the single most important discussion for our purposes, explaining the trajectory of Russia in the international system vis-a-vis the United States and Europe. Because when Putin gets started, he is pro-Western, like very substantially pro-Western. You alluded to, yes, he made use of some anti-Western sentiment in the country, but I think that was a little bit more around getting Russia up off its back onto its feet, and being able to join the community of nations and the West, being able to modernize and become a part of the West. Like, this went up to and including discussion in 2000 and 2001 about Russia potentially joining NATO, which is crazy, but those conversations happened.
Yeah, I mean, one wonders what the purpose of NATO would be, given that the alliance existed in the first place as a check on Soviet and then the Soviet and then Russian threat. But yeah, those conversations did happen, and there was talk of a new European security architecture. I don't think those were taken too seriously in terms of Russia joining NATO, at least by most of the Europeans. But yeah, and we've mentioned on this show that one of the first phone calls that George W. Bush received after 9/11 was from Putin offering to cooperate on anti-Islamic counterterrorism campaigns. I think you mentioned on a previous show, would have been very difficult for the United States to wage the war in Afghanistan without Russian cooperation.
It would have been impossible because they used staging in Russian bases in Central Asia, which basically bordered Afghanistan from the north. And the way we did Afghanistan is we used the Northern Alliance as our hammer, basically, against the Taliban. It came in out of the north.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have worked otherwise. Really
different time, by the way. U.S. was getting cooperation for that war from both Russia and from the Iranians, who provided a lot of intelligence cooperation on Taliban positions. So
yeah,
pretty interesting.
Times have changed.
Yeah. Well, if I were going to pick the first phase, and I'm literally making these terms up as I go, but we'll call it anti-unipolarity phase is the phase of evolution. Look, Putin, by all accounts, very much resented the way the United States went about preparing for the war in Iraq in 2003. It's worth noting he was not alone in that, right? The French and the Germans and a number of
Yeah, Schrader, right?
yeah. And Chirac very much opposed the United States invading Iraq, as did, one could argue, most of the world.
Other than Tony Blair.
Yeah, Tony Blair. So he wasn't unique in that, but I think that was viewed in Russia generally and by Putin specifically as a middle finger saying, you don't matter. Russia is not a force that we have to worry about, which would have been very much in keeping with the general US attitude toward Russia during the 1990s. And you can find all sorts of quotations from high-ranking US officials saying more or less that explicitly about things like contemplating the enlargement of NATO. So that was a big moment. The other thing that's happening in this period, roughly 2003 to 2005, are what's known as the color revolutions, which happened in Georgia, I believe Kyrgyzstan, and most notably Ukraine in 2004. We'll obviously get to Ukraine, which is the key country here, but it seems to be a moment when Ukraine might be moving more toward the West. And toward the European Union. And this is something that does not sit well with Putin. And if you look from the standpoint of today, that should not be terribly surprising. That kind of resolves itself when Ukrainians of their own will end up electing a Putin ally later in just a few years. And so it puts a cap back on things temporarily, but you can see the origins of where we get today. So a combination of ignoring Russia as a factor and from the Russian standpoint, seeming to encroach on some of its key interests in its neighborhood. Like this is generally seen to culminate in the 2007 Munich Security Conference, which is generally held up as a big moment where Putin gives this speech and he condemns a lot of US actions, including stuff like NATO enlargement. But the gist of the speech is unipolarity is not working for us. And American arrogance and the idea that the US runs the world and doesn't have to listen to what anyone else thinks, and Russia in particular, is going to be a major problem. And Russia's not going to take it sitting down anymore. And of course, the next year, Russia invades Georgia. So I would say that's the first phase of his evolution, is this resentment toward unipolarity and the US attitude toward world affairs, which he views as very disrespectful and arrogant.
Yeah, there's an interesting tension here between what I said earlier, which is that Putin comes in as pro-Western, and what you have described surrounding the color revolutions in Russians near abroad. These are former Soviet socialist republics, by the way, but they're not Russia. And if Russia is to be pro-Western, if it is to be a democracy, even in name, then what is the problem with democratic revolutions in these places, right? It's like, why is this such a problem that Ukraine wants to move closer to the West? Russia also putatively wants to move closer to the West, and the Georgians and the Kyrgyz. So like, what's going on here? And I think it's a combination of factors. Russia needed foreign capital from the rich West in order to reestablish its economy and get growing again. Like, it needed Western expertise. Putin surrounded himself initially with a bunch of basically Western style economists and technocrats who were good at their jobs and got the Russian economy growing again. So the question is, was he actually pro-Western, or was he just saying that he was pro-Western to get what he needed when he was in fact still a Russian nationalist and in mind of reestablishing the Soviet empire even this early? Was it that he just didn't have the capability to do it until 2007 and 2008, after 8 years of continuous economic growth? What do you think?
I'm not sure it's an either or. And one thing that's tough about these things is the evidence is spotty. One, we're dealing with relatively recent events, but two, we're dealing with, say what one will about US classification. The US declassifies a lot of important documents.
Russia, not so much,
pretty
huh?
critical for me to do my research, for example. I think to a certain extent, everyone would be speculating somewhat given the nature of the evidence, but my sense is he was a Russian nationalist all along. Uh,
Always has been.
I don't think that makes him unique among world leaders.
Hmm.
I suppose we could debate that. I think there was a willingness to pursue relations with the United States and Europe on a business-like basis, at least initially, but only insofar as that would provide for his interests. And his interests, I think, probably, as is the case for many great powers, maintaining a Russian sphere of influence in Russia's near abroad. The extent that these independent countries were not going to go along with that, and that Western Europe and later big chunks of Eastern Europe and the United States were going to support things like the Color Revolution, yeah, then I think conflict was probably inevitable. Whether it would have gotten to the point we're at today if US foreign policy had looked different and the war in Iraq hadn't happened and some of the things we're going to mention in just a bit hadn't happened, hard to say. But that's my sense, is that at least initially he's someone that was willing to try to do business with the
Right.
Americans.
Yep.
Whether it was business the Americans would have been willing to accept and reciprocate, I think that's hard to say.
I want to double click on a point you just made and compare it to the United States, right? The United States also doesn't appreciate what big domestic changes in politics in countries in its near abroad, particularly Latin America. It's very routinely meddled in and invaded Latin American countries during the Cold War that got too close to the Soviet Union. And now it's starting to put pressure on places like Panama for being too close to the Chinese.
Well, and Cuba has not been in a good place with the
Yeah,
United States for some time. Neither.
that's exactly right. So we can criticize Putin for the color revolutions and so on, right? The United States has done it too. And to a certain extent, this is what big countries do, right? This is how international politics work.
So, I mean, yeah, like I guess we can suffice it to say it's complicated. I do want to talk briefly about Ukraine in that regard, which is I
Yeah.
do think maybe it's obvious from the standpoint of 2025. I do think Ukraine is special in this respect.
Brzezinski would agree with
Well,
you, in fact.
you just took the words out of my mouth. So why don't you give the Brzezinski quote?
Yeah, I'll paraphrase unless you have it in front of you. It's
I
basically
don't.
like, okay, like Russia cannot be an empire without possessing Ukraine.
Yeah,
Is
that's
basically what he
that's
said.
the gist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Carter's national security advisor is Zbigniew Brzezinski. Yeah, that's basically the quote is without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. And so I think that's an especially sensitive one for the Russians. And so of the color revolutions, the Ukrainian, I think it's the Orange Revolution. I'll have to double check that.
I think you're right.
That was a key one. All right. So I would say that's a first phase. The second phase, in some ways, is the one that gets less attention, but that I think might be the most important one. I'm talking about after he's taken power formally. And that's the first Obama term.
Mm.
So Obama famously comes in 2009, proposing a reset in US-Russian relations. And I suppose this is one of those moments where the way things start perfectly encapsulate what ends up happening, which is Hillary Clinton, Obama's Secretary of State, brings like a button that's supposed to say reset on it that the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is going to push. And the translation is wrong. It doesn't actually say reset. I forget what the translation is, but that's not what it says. I think Lavrov points out like, hey, this is not what this word actually means in Russian.
That's pretty funny.
Now, initially, there are some successes, right? Like we do get a new nuclear arms control treaty in 2010, the New
Start. Yep.
Things go south pretty quickly. I think one major event here is the 2011 U.S. intervention in Libya, which eventually leads to the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and later his death. It's important to note, by the way, Putin is not president of Russia during this phase.
He's the prime minister. He's done a do-si-do with Dmitry Medvedev, who you might now recognize from his the crazy stuff he says on Twitter.
Yes, Medvedev has morphed from seemingly pro-Western liberal guy to an ultra hawk on Ukraine, saying all sorts of inflammatory things.
Yeah, he's like this rodeo clown now who just says he like threatens like full scale nuclear war. And he says something outrageous, what, quarterly, maybe monthly. But yeah, at this point in time, he was actually nominally in control of Russia. In all likelihood, this was not true. Putin was actually still in control, but he needed to exit power constitutionally.
Yeah. So, I mean, by the way, like this is something that's debated. So, Obama's ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who later wrote a book like From Cold War to Hot Peace or something like that. He wrote an article in International Security, I believe in 2020, where I think he takes Medvedev somewhat more seriously. I should double check this, but I think he says like Putin would not have gone along with the Russian abstention at the UN Security Council on the intervention in Libya if he had been president. But at the very least, let's put it this way, Medvedev not acting in an unconstrained role. Putin is very much in the shadows, and everyone knows, like, given the chance, he's going to get back in the game, which of course he does in 2012. So the Libya operation important because in the Russian view, and by the way, I would say in my own view, the Americans and everyone else overstepped the mandate, which was to prevent a slaughter at Benghazi. And ultimately, this expands into a regime change operation. And this does not sit well with Putin at all. And I would actually say the bigger event has to do with Russia's parliamentary elections in December 2011 and then Putin's re-election in March 2012, which witnessed major Russian protests in a lot of Russia's largest cities. And something that happens after the legislative elections in December 2011 is that Hillary Clinton basically accuses, I think by most accounts accurately, the Russians of not carrying out free elections and there being all sorts of fraud. And by all accounts, this infuriates Putin and might actually have been one of his personal motivations for trying to undermine her presidential campaign in 2016, although I don't think that's the main reason for what the Russians did there. But this is seen as an unacceptable U.S. interference in Russia's internal affairs. And to me, this might be the key moment when Russia decides we've reached a point of no return.
Yeah. Well, Russia or Putin, or are those
Putin,
the same things?
No, I mean, I should have said Putin. That Putin at this point says, okay, like we can't do business with these guys, whether that's because of no state takes it well when other countries intervene in its domestic affairs, whether it was because he was targeted specifically as a corrupt autocrat, rigging elections, or because he thought we've tried to do business over these things and or some of Russia's key interests and there's no compromise to be reached. I couldn't tell you, but that seems to be a very critical moment. And of course, it's just about a year later that he decides to invade and annex Crimea and start a major conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Right.
So that, I would say, is the second phase. And I think from that point, we're no longer in a period where things had been moving in a bad direction with Putin by 2007, 2008. I think by 2012, any chance that things could be healed or the rift mended, I think, are out the window.
Yeah, there's a clear breaking point in there. I think you're drawing it to Putin's return for a questionable third term. Makes a lot of sense. This is also around the time that the last remaining Russian dissident who actually matters comes to prominence, Alexei Navalny, right? Who passed away, I think, about a year ago.
In prison.
In prison, yeah, in basically a Soviet-style gulag in Siberia. But at this point in time, he starts to post on YouTube about basically Putin's corruption and pointing out that Putin actually is one of the richest people in the world. He has all of these mansions and super yachts that.
And I found an estimate, and this is from 2015. So
yeah,
who knows what it is now, but that he was worth $40 billion. I don't know if anyone really knows, but if that's true, that's a remarkable sum.
I don't think anybody actually knows because these assets are not held by him directly. They're held by his inner circle, oligarchs, and so on. He just gets to use them however and whenever he wants, which I think is synonymous with ownership. last time I checked. According to those estimates, and considering that he controls Russia pretty much as an absolute autocrat at this point in time, and Russia sits on trillions of dollars in oil and gas reserves and is a major economy in and of itself. I think the current estimate is around $200 billion. But like it's not meaningful, right? Because he is synonymous with Russia.
Yeah.
He's as rich as Russia is, right?
200 billion would be an even more remarkable sum.
Yes, it would make him certainly one of the top 10 richest people in the world. But yeah, prior to Musk and Zuckerberg and those guys really getting, over $100 billion, he would have been the richest. He is probably one of the most powerful people on earth as well. And Navalny was the guy who is trying to stop Putin from being synonymous with Russia as he now is.
Yeah.
Didn't work, but Putin was clearly worried about him, especially later in Navalny's career. He clearly had an effect.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, though, to one of your points you earlier made about Putin being ruthless but effective, I mean, it does seem to have been effective that he probably had him or almost certainly had him assassinated in prison.
Yeah, he almost had him assassinated outside of prison.
Yeah.
And Navalny, if he had stayed away from Russia, he had an opportunity to stay alive and live in Germany. He knew that if he went back to Russia, he would likely end up dead. And he intended to be a martyr, and he was. He is, I think, one of the more impressive people in this entire story. And he is a part of Putin's story that we need to keep in mind.
Well, okay. So if phase one was this anti-unipolarity, like cautious reaching out period that ultimately ends negatively, and then 2012, 2013, 2014 is the point of no return, I would say 2015 onward is like full on hostility. Now, we should say, by the way, like, again, Trump and Putin are meeting today, and maybe they'll be able to work something out. And maybe it will be a nice test case of the various explanations for Putin's behavior we've laid out. Is this because he sees Trump as someone ideologically similar and that Trump has authoritarian tendencies? Is it because he thinks Trump is someone he can manipulate and wring a good deal out of? Is it because he just thinks Trump's someone who sees the world as he does and who can do business with him on a spheres of influence like basis? I guess we will get some answers, probably not all those answers. But 2015 onward, a bunch of things happen. You get Russia's intervention in Syria, which I think is done for a combination of Russia has longstanding ties to Syria. There's a check or an FU to the United States that there's not going to be a Libya 2.0. One could argue Russia has a naval base there. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's ideological and standing up for other authoritarians. Partly it's stability in the region, right? This is a time when ISIS is on a rampage. So there's a bunch of factors in there. But in any case, Russia's intervening to prop up the Assad family, which the Obama administration does not like. 2016, you of course get Russian intervention in the US presidential election. And I think that's the year when the Panama Papers get released, which is another instance where Putin, I think, by some accounts, views the United States as trying to weaken him internally by revealing all of this corruption and all this wealth he's built up over the years. Then there's COVID, and some analysts say that Putin becomes increasingly paranoid and irrational during this period because he's isolated. I have some issues with this interpretation. I remember very well Donald Trump getting a lot of shit and COVID for not isolating. So it seems to me that's maybe an unfair metric, but by some accounts, this leads him to engage in all sorts of crazy theories. He does a lot of research about how Ukraine is actually a part of Russia, and this continues to.
Oh, yeah. He writes a multi-100-page essay about this on the historical unity of the Ukrainian Russian peoples, right? I didn't read it. I don't know about you.
I did not read it either, but I think basically the title gives away everything you need to know.
Yes.
Subsequent history gives away everything you need to know. You get the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And you also get this Chinese-Russian partnership, which is directly aimed at the United States and its allies. And so I think now we're in a situation where the two sides are completely at odds. And whether this is an evolution in terms of ideological hostility or it's a case of an autocrat acquiring total power because Russia has become far less free internally as well during this period, or it's a genuine clash over geopolitical interests relating to Russia's near abroad. It's probably a combination of all those things. I think there's a case to be made, though, that his popularity has waned, and depending on how things go in the war, it will continue to wane. But at the end of the day, many Russians still see him as someone who upholds Russian greatness and status as a great power. He's able to play on this anti-Western sentiment, and he has provided a modicum of stability, at least up until now. And you cannot count the guy out. He's been in power for 26 years this month.
Yep. And he's now in his early 70s. And yeah, it's like one of the interesting developments is that he was not seen as a particularly ideological figure earlier in his career, certainly in the 90s and through the 2000s, other than maybe just bog standard Russian nationalism. There was no hint of Eurasianism or anything like this, but he now employs court ideologists and pseudo historians who have cooked up imperial Russian ideology for him, right? I think not necessarily to establish a cult of personality or anything like that. I don't think he has needed to do that yet, although the further we go into the Ukraine war and arguably the worse things go, the more necessary it is to have a state ideology that people subscribe to like make an alliance with the Orthodox Church and hang your hat on that source of legitimacy. Over time, the sources of legitimacy have gone away from like technocratic competence and economic growth and towards like, oh, we're reestablishing the Russian Empire and we're fighting God's fight and against the godless atheists in the West, right? And Putin is a civilizational champion of the Russian world and so on. And Russia, most importantly, is its own thing. It's not part of the West. It's not part of the East. It's Eurasian, right? We've talked a little bit about that earlier on this in different episodes on this show. All of that is as a consequence of, I think, what you said. It's like his popularity has waned. It's hard to get a good idea of what his popularity actually is anymore, and Russia no longer has a free media to speak of. There are a few remaining independent pollsters because even in autocracies, the autocrats want to gain an idea of how people feel because they're subject to being overturned in a revolution. And
that's
I think
good information to have.
Yeah, you kind of need to know that. But he's ex-KGB, and he probably has informants everywhere, right? Russia is now a security state. I have heard Russia called by certain sources fascist, and the state of permanent war between Russia and the West in the form of the Ukraine war is one of the enabling conditions for fascism, along with the idealization of an imperial past and particular ethnic group and so on. Most of the people dying on the Russian side at this point are not necessarily ethnic Russians. They're peoples from the hinterlands of the Russian Federation, Siberia, and so on. They're getting sent to the front and huge bonuses in order to join up, right? But the idea is basically to move the consequences away from Moscow and into the regions where it doesn't matter as much. That's how you know that this isn't going well, right? And if Putin doesn't get relief of some kind, a resumption of business ties or economic ties or trade ties at this meeting in Alaska from Trump, Trump recently slapped 50% sanctions on India for taking Russian oil. That's significant, right? That's one of the last remaining lifelines economically for Putin. And he's not going to be able to pay those bonuses and keep people quiet, keep the war away from Moscow and the imperial core if he doesn't get relief. So that's what he's going to be looking for. He's running out of sources of legitimacy, basically.
Yeah. Which, like, this discussion raises a whole bunch of questions in my mind. Like, were there missed opportunities? That's always a big one. Hey, if people in the West had made different decisions, would this look different today? Or was this just kind of
Inevitable.
go
Yeah.
this way based on a basic clash of ideological and or geopolitical interests? Like, what does the future hold in terms of Putin's political fortunes? I checked right before we started that he is now constitutionally allowed technically to run or be in office all the way until 2036
Yep.
because he won his fifth election last year and he's allowed
Well
to
into his 80s,
do
just
more
like our
things.
leaders.
Right,
Gerontocracy.
which is funny because it was like Reagan in the 80s was like, I'd love to meet the Soviets, but they keep dying on me because they were all
Yeah.
in their 80s. So seems to have flipped on that one. So that's a key question. What's going to come of this summit? I'm going to hold off on that since I think you and I have already talked quite a bit on what possible settlements to Ukraine might look like here. And above all, based purely on what we're concerned with, like what explains these shifts that we've seen within Putin? I think we've laid out a pretty big list, and my guess is it's multi-causal and has to do with external factors, internal factors in Russian politics, and things about Putin himself personally.
Unsatisfying, but undoubtedly true.
Yeah, but I want to just hit on what you were just saying, which is his sources of legitimacy. Yeah, like we've named quite a few, stability being the big one initially, both economic and internal order, respect, self-respect, and status as a great power being another one. Are those things that are going to continue? The war has not gone as planned. And there have been economic implications since then, or is he increasingly going to have to rely on to stay in power, basically brute force and brutal methods? And he's more than capable of those things at this point. And then lastly, like, as far as I can tell, no one has any good idea of who his successor might be. And maybe
Yes.
too early to be talking about that because he might be in power for another decade.
Yeah, he might be. One name I've heard is this guy, Nikolai Patrushev. He used to lead as the director of the FSB in the early part of Putin's tenure. But more recently, he was secretary of Russia's Security Council through May of 2024. But he's been demoted. So much for Patrushev.
Yeah, you don't want to acquire too much power in a system.
Yeah, or you don't want to like screw up somehow, right?
Right.
He probably screwed up in the context of the Ukraine war. It's like bad intelligence, right? And this is one of the things about the Putinocracy, which is another thing I've heard Russia's special system called, right? Or the Putinate, right? Like the Sultanate. It's like he values loyalty for sure. That's very important, but competence is also extremely important. And because that's how he came to power, and it's what's kept him in power. It's loyalty and competence. Like just one or the other, not sufficient. So that's pretty important.
Now, the last point I'm going to make, and then I'll leave it to you or we can wrap.
Yeah.
A big part of this in my mind does remain structural. And here I'm again taking from the article I mentioned by Stephen Kotkin. I think it's called The Resistible Rise of Vladimir Putin's in Foreign Affairs. The point he makes at the end of that article that I really liked was, regardless of what you think of Putin individually or the specific characteristics of Russia's politics, the basic problem we are now dealing with when it comes to European security is that the system as it currently exists was the result of a period that was largely anomalous.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that after the First World War, Russian and German power were basically destroyed, and you needed to build a new system that grappled with the fact that those were countries that would inevitably recover and become key centers of power again. Europe today, at least the legal system and basic security architecture, is largely a function of a period during which Russian power had collapsed. And however we're going to get to a peaceful and stable Europe, and I can tell you if and when that's going to happen, is going to have to wrestle with the fact that I don't remember where you had Russia on your great power rankings, but
it was number 10, 9 or 10, I believe. Yeah.
it's still a power that has to be dealt with, and it's not where it was in 1995 anymore.
For sure. And like it's 9 or 10, but it's also fully mobilized in a way that France and Germany and the UK are not, and maybe never again will be. That's very significant.
Yeah, and I guess I mentioned earlier what maybe we'll get some answers on who Putin is and what he wants, like depending on if there is a settlement and what it looks like here. That might
Yeah.
give us some clues.
Yeah. I want to close on this question, which is not so much about Putin, but just the situation as it stands right now. What would you hope to see, given the circumstances on the ground in the Ukraine war, out of this summit? Like, what would be like a
Yeah.
good outcome,
So,
considering what's actually happening?
look, I would say that regardless of what the outcome is, no one's going to like it. I think it's probably not going to be popular among many people, that I think there's probably going to have to be some territorial changes.
Mhm.
The reality in my mind is, short of like the United States or other major European countries directly joining this war as direct combatants, which I think would be a bad idea for a whole host of reasons, I don't see the Ukrainians being able to retake their territories.
Mhm.
And so I think there's going to have to be some sort of settlement that reckons with the fact that the Russians have taken some of those eastern provinces. We've talked about this before, the specific security guarantees Ukraine is going to have to get as part of the settlement. If I knew the answer to how to solve that one, I'd probably be making a lot of money somewhere else. But I do want the war to end. And I would love it if that could be in a way where the Ukrainians were happy and the Russians were happy and the Europeans were happy and the Americans were happy. But I just don't see that as a realistic war or
Mhm.
outcome, excuse me. And as a person studying US grand strategy, I am of the opinion, as are some within the current administration, that the bigger fish to fry at the moment is China.
Mhm.
And I don't think this is a theater that demands as much US attention. So if there is a way in which Trump and Putin can work something out that is at least minimally acceptable to all parties, I would like to see that be the outcome. But I understand that's going to infuriate a number of people who are more supportive of Ukraine. What about you? Thanks.
So I would like to see the fighting end as well. I agree with your assessment that land swaps of some kind, and actually Trump's assessment, he said this too, are probably in the offing. I do not think Russia will ever be dislodged from the territories it's currently controlled, but at this point, those territories are destroyed and huge liabilities. They weren't that great to begin with, but like, it's like, tell him what he's won, Johnny. Like, nothing that great. My big question is whether Putin can actually afford for the war to end.
Mm,
Because of what I said a little bit earlier about the Russian system being effectively fascist at this point and a security state, and the justification for that being the war. Everything is directed towards the war, including the entire economy now. So if the war were to end, there's going to be a major shock, a dislocation as the economy, which has been bent out of shape to support war production, basically goes back to producing consumer goods. Guys come back from the front disgruntled, massive political risks. So just looking at that and thinking about Putin and thinking that he wants to be around for another 10 years at
yeah.
least, right? It's like,
Well,
does this even make sense for him on the face of it?
I guess this is what I mean by maybe we'll get some answers. I'm guessing we won't, but
Yeah,
you could separate things out. I think it was Timothy Snyder at Yale who called Russia fascist back in like 2022.
right.
Look, if this is about ideology, um, and there's no settlement out there to be had because Putin is unremittingly hostile and has revisionist goals that cannot be met,
Right.
we'll see what Trump offers him. And I suspect whatever Trump offers him will not be something the Ukrainians or the other Europeans like.
Right.
Depending on what Trump offers him, if Putin says no, that might be a hint. I wouldn't say it's like the debate is settled, but that would be a useful piece of information. If Trump says something like, look, Ukraine isn't going to be in NATO, but it's going to be supplied with sophisticated US weapons. Maybe there's a way of dressing up that those are US weapons by funneling
Hmm.
them through other NATO countries or something for face saving purposes. You can keep these four provinces in the east, something to that effect, and we're lifting the sanctions and you can rejoin the family of nations as the United States sees things. And oh, by the way, maybe we're able to cooperate more on China, and drive a wedge between those countries. That would be more of an indication that he's motivated by power, political, traditional national security considerations.
Yeah.
I don't know.
To me, Putin is in a position now where he's having to balance different types of risk. And maybe he always has been, right? It's like there's the economic risk that I alluded to, there's the popularity risk, there's the risk of fricking losing the war,
Yeah.
which could still happen. There's like revolutionary risk at this point. We had the Prigozhin incident much earlier in the war, which was scary. That was a column of tanks headed towards Moscow. And it didn't get that far, but it's like that was pretty significant to Putin, certainly. Prigozhin, in his plane, ended up carrying a cargo of live grenades about a year later. So that's what tends to happen. Or you accidentally fall out a window to guys that mess with Putin. But it's like, if you have to do that all the time, that's a really bad sign.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, how do you step back from this process that he set in motion in a way that maintains his power? And it's like, maybe there's a window there, but it's not a window that you want to fall out of, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, I think there probably is a path toward him accepting a good enough deal if it
he would need a
allows
lot of
him.
US help.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
But I think one could argue, I'm sure I'll get criticized for saying this, but in purely geopolitical strategic terms, the United States has an interest in ending this war for a whole bunch
Yep.
of reasons.
Yeah.
I think Trump has indicated he's willing to go that route based on the initial proposals he laid out after he took office in his second term.
Yep.
So if this is a deal where Putin can say, hey, like, we have crushed, I think he was referring to Ukrainian Nazis at the start of the war. We've eliminated the threat from Ukraine. We've restored Russian greatness and re-seized these territories. The sanctions are getting lifted. So look, we're going to have good economic growth at some point after maybe a bumpy period of war demobilization. Given the fact that he does command the key levers of power in Russia and can govern through intimidation and fear at home as well, he probably, I think, could pull that off.
Yeah.
Which is why maybe this will be a good test to see what he's really about.
Yeah. I like that.
How much his views have evolved since 2000 when, as we've discussed, we were dealing with maybe a different individual than we are today.
Yeah, I see your point. Nobody stays exactly the same over the course of 25 years. They just become more of who they are. That's how I think about it. So, yeah, he's now in a position to be who he is in a very big way. And he's showing us what that is. And you could say it's ugly, or you could say it's historic.
Or both.
Or both, yeah. Anyway, let's leave it there. This has been a great discussion, buddy.
Yeah, as always, man.
Yeah. All right. Till next time, this has been Global Tantrum.